Okay, we ready?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
We are your three hosts. We have Matteo Grasso, Björn
Hello.
Erik Ewell,
Hello.
and myself, Jeremiah Hendren. And today we are looking at the content of the first page of the IIT Wiki. And our goal on that overview page is to try to give an accessible introduction to IT without getting into math for sure, and also without getting into too much jargon, confusing terms, etc. So we're really going to do our very best with this. It's a challenge. I'm sure we'll have to introduce a few terms and so on, but that's really the idea. So I think our first question to get into here is, what do we mean by consciousness in IIT?
So when we use the term consciousness, we do that. We use it in our daily language way of speaking, of course, and we mean somebody has lost consciousness. Somebody, when they fall asleep, we fall asleep, we lose consciousness. Consciousness is also a term that sometimes it's used in medical sciences to refer to cognitive abilities, but in IIT, the main definition, the meaning of the word conscious is closer to just the idea that you feel something. There's something it is like to be you, which is right now, it can include you're seeing some images, you're hearing some sounds, you have a feeling of your body. All these things are part of your experience. So just having an experience, being conscious, that's what we mean when we talk about consciousness. This definition is in line with what Thomas Nagel, philosopher, defined as phenomenal consciousness, and termed in this sense with the phrase "what is like to be you," describe it as exactly using these words. So this is the first meaning we have.
In my sense, there's more or less a growing consensus of people using the term consciousness in the sense that you're describing, more or less as synonymous with the word experience. Sometimes people say subjective experience, but
Right.
a lot of people point out that's actually redundant to say that. You can't have an experience that isn't subjective. And a lot of people invoke this famous phrase, as you said, from Thomas Nagel, what it is like to be anything at all. My sense is that there's a growing consensus that people more or less are using that term. But maybe that's just because I'm, immersed in the IIT world. Maybe, other people are still using other terms prominently. What do you guys think of that? I mean, I know, Björn, you're very active among neuroscientists, also outside of the IIT circle and so on. I mean, is there a consensus when people use this word consciousness now, or not so much?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a consensus. I think there is more people are kind of introducing the term consciousness in their papers, with accompanied by saying something like phenomenal consciousness, or defining it as what it is like to be, or these terms, just to kind of have a definition on the table. But other scientists or people working in this field also explicitly say that they're not studying phenomenal consciousness. Some people focus on what they call conscious processing, for example, or some people say that they're only interested in access consciousness, a term coined by another philosopher, which is kind of more cognitive in nature and not so much about the experience itself. And also, so I wouldn't say there's a consensus. And also, like Matteo said, there is the medical literature where consciousness, really means something different, right? It's more akin to what you might call responsiveness. If a person is able to coherently respond to stimuli, then you would say they are conscious, yeah, or especially if they also remember and so on and so forth. But in like the academic field of studying consciousness, I feel like there has been at least a sliding towards a consensus of defining consciousness as experience, or what it's like to be subjective first person being, so to speak. Uh, at least when you kind of start your paper in the definition of
Mhm.
what you're trying to study, and then there's a whole
Mhm.
different story of what you're actually studying. But that's but
Okay.
But has to do with, problems of science and really in relation to consciousness, and it's not so much about what you define. But I think many more people have a hope of studying, phenomenal consciousness and this first person perspective.
So consciousness, of course, comes always with some cognitive functions that Bjorn mentioned, like to know that somebody is conscious, you interact with them, right? We speak, they move, they detect things with sight or hearing. So I think in recent years, what happened is that when people talk about consciousness, they try to be a little more precise in isolating this aspect without saying that the others are not there. Of course, when you're conscious, you're also alert and you're also responsive and you're also awake most of the time. You might be conscious in dreaming. So yes, I think in the last probably 10 to 20 years, the term conscious has been refined to refer to this, what is called phenomenal conscious by philosophers, which is really the fact that it feels like something to be you or somebody.
And okay, I think I would like just to mention not again, but I would like to just mention that this word to be, or this phrase to be, that comes in at the end there, I think it's important for the definition. So sometimes when you talk about this definition, some people only say what it's like. But personally, and for IIT, I think this last part of that phrase, to be, what it is like to be, is an essential component, right? It's like it ties the whole idea of experience to the notion of existence. So whenever you exist as a subject, so to speak, there is something it's like to be, so there is something it feels like to be. It's a neat little thing to remember because it's often shortened down, that phrase, to be only the what it's likeness, for example. And I think it loses something when you skip the last part, the to be part.
Yeah, and as we'll see later, when we get into the IIT method, indeed, we start from the fact of our own experience. Right? We start from this fact not only in an epistemological sense, but even in an ontological sense, right? Where we know that our experience is indeed existent. Okay, so we've given some outline of a definition of consciousness here, and we should be clear that as a theory of consciousness, what we're trying to do is account for this. Why does it feel like something to be us? Or in metaphorical sense, why are the lights on? Probably most listeners have spent a lot of time thinking about this already, but maybe there are a few, let's say, first timers to the field of consciousness science. And in my experience, a lot of people have never thought about this as a scientific question. And to put it in perspective a bit, if you come at, or if you're a physicist or you study biochemistry, or if you have some sense of how the universe evolved all the way to the point of us being here right now having this conversation, you can actually account for all of it from the Big Bang until this very moment without necessarily the lights being on, so to speak, right? Without necessarily it feeling like anything to be us right now having this conversation, and without it having ever felt like anything to be anything. So this question of why the lights are on, right? Why it feels like something, why we have this inner world. When you really start thinking about it, it's hard. It's very difficult to approach this from a scientific perspective, even. In any case, this is what IIT tries to do. Let's say a humble task to try to account for why it feels like something to be us. I think our next, let's say, chunk of questions should be, so what do we mean when we talk about having a theory of consciousness? And I would emphasize theory with a capital T here. There's really a proliferation of theories, I would say, with lowercase t's. There's a proliferation of ideas, conjectures. They often get the label theory. I think in some recent review papers, there are as many as 25 different competing theories of consciousness. So what do you guys think of that as what does it mean to be a theory of consciousness, and how does IIT maybe approach this word theory in a way that might be the same or might also be different from other approaches to this question?
So first, based on what you just said, I want to clarify what I think being a theory of consciousness does not mean necessarily. So you said that in trying to account for consciousness, we're trying to explain why the lights are on. And very often this question is interpreted as asking the question why consciousness emerged, or why consciousness appeared at a certain point, or was generated by some specific biological system that reached a certain level of complexity. And this is a legitimate question. However, this is not really the question that IIT tries to ask, or at least it might provide an answer along these lines, but the real question is not to provide an account of consciousness and why it appeared, but it is to provide an account of consciousness in physical terms, which is a different story. To me, the best way to describe the goal of IIT is to say, there is experience, we know, it's a fact, and we can only explain it in a sense, we can only describe it in first personal terminology. I can talk about my experience, but is there a way to account for it in physical terms, meaning to use an indirect and, let's say, mathematical, rigorous, quantifiable way to actually describe it and describe what it is? And if we do so, we also account for it in physical terms. We say, what are the properties of a physical system that when they are instantiated or satisfied, then there is consciousness, right? So to me, a theory of consciousness needs to account for consciousness in physical terms, in the sense that it has to describe the necessary and sufficient properties of a substrate for it to be conscious. And that's the first thing that a theory needs to do, which means it needs to explain the properties that are necessary and sufficient for the presence or absence of consciousness, right? But also it needs to explain the fact that when consciousness is there, it usually feels one way rather than another. So for instance, if I have a visual experience that is of a blue sky, this is one type of experience. If I have an experience of, let's say, I don't know, a dark sky, that's a different type of experience. If I have an experience that is visual, but I also hear music, that's a different type of experience. So explaining the difference between experiences is also something that a theory should achieve, despite just the presence or absence of experience altogether.
Oh, and that's a good clarification with the sort of preamble I gave to this, to say, most approaches to this question of experience or question of consciousness, they would frame it in terms of, why did consciousness appear, right? Through evolutionary time or the over from the Big Bang until today, why did consciousness appear? And IIT doesn't approach it in that way at all. As it's a good clarification that you give there, where we basically say, actually, we're sure it does exist because we're having this experience right now. In fact, as we'll get into later, that's the one thing we can be sure to be true, in the Cartesian sense. So the way that IIT is approaching this question is to say, well, given that this does exist, as you're saying, we want to be able to figure out why is it present versus absent. And then, as you're saying nicely, why do specific experiences feel the way they do, right? And a complete theory of consciousness has to also address this area, which sometimes goes under the kind of jargony philosophy term of qualia, right? Why does, the typical example is, why does red feel red? Why does pain feel painful, etc.? So those are the two big buckets of questions that we feel have to be answered, and they're big buckets. Well, the presence versus absence is a little more tractable, let's say, as a bucket, a little more clearly defined. But the qualia question, at least in theory, means you literally have to account for every variation of experience, or at least have the tools to be able to account for, right, every variation of specific experiences.
You've said to account for these types of experiences, and you asked the question why so many times. Now, I would like to ask you both guys a question, which is, well, what does it mean to answer the question, why does red feel the way it does? Or also, because I'm of course hinting at the fact that there's a difference between knowing that you are experiencing red when some part of your visual cortex is activated and knowing why. So do you want to say anything about this?
I want to say plenty of things about it, but actually want to ask Björn, how do neuroscientists feel about that question in general? And the reason I ask that is, from a neuroscientific perspective, if you, or let's say from empirical neuroscience or mainstream perspective, if you want to somehow answer why does red feel red, you can construct an answer that has something to do with rods and cones and parts of the brain and visual cortex and I don't know what. And basically, I think if you check off enough kind of mechanistic causes, if for lack of a better word, and if you check off enough of them, I think a lot of neuroscientists would say, okay, we've given the answer why red feels to be red. I mean, I'm probably caricaturing far too much here, but what do you think of that, Björn? Is that an approach that some neuroscientists would have to answering this why question?
I'm sure. So I think if you were pushing them to kind of give you an answer to why red feels red, I think they would go down that sort of line. I honestly, I don't think most neuroscientists, even vision neuroscientists, actually try to answer that question, and nor do they kind of intend to answer that question. But I do think if you kind of really try to push them, they will say something about, oh, well, it's because, there's a photon with a certain wavelength that activates a certain photoreceptor that, activates a certain set of neurons that, again, activate other neurons in the cortex through certain mechanisms. And you can see that anytime I shine a red light, these neurons light up. And right now you can see that the red light, no, those neurons are lighting up. Therefore, this person is seeing something red. My real answer is that I don't really think they explicitly want to answer that question, like why does red feel like red? And I think that's perfectly fair. But I think in the science of consciousness, if you want to explain experiences, if that's what you want to account for, or better yet, predict what it feels like to be some other system, I think that's a thing that we haven't really gotten at yet. But I think when we talk about explaining why it feels the way it does, I think you mentioned it, Jeremiah, we're already taking for granted that the experience is what it is, right? So there is a red experience happening now. Your task is to figure out why is that particular experience taking place for this particular subject at this particular time, right? And if
And what I'm trying to also dig at with my being devil's advocate with this a little bit is to say, how have we answered the question if we give that complete kind of, mechanistic rundown of physical conditions coming together,
Well, that's the part that I was asking about. It's
yeah.
Maybe I actually think it's a little confusing to ask the question why red feels red. That's a question that is we can talk about that, but
okay, you'd have to say something like why are we experiencing red or something.
Yeah, but something along the lines of, for instance, a typical example that philosophers really like is that all the progress in neuroscience got us to know a lot of the neural correlates of contents of experience. For instance, classical philosopher's example is pain is the firing of the C fibers, right? So asking the question, yes, but you know that pain corresponds to the firing of the C fibers, and you can even say that firing of C fibers feels like pain, but then you can ask the question, why? Why the firing of the C fibers and not something else? And similarly, we can ask the question, why the double opponent cells firing, that feels like red, right? And that's a different type of question.
Exactly.
And I think in science, there's a difference in knowing that the firing of some double opponent cells corresponds to your experience of red and knowing why.
Yeah.
I think with red, actually, it's even harder. There are some examples that are a little more approachable. So for instance, we can ask the question, why some modalities feel, for instance, spatial more than others. If I talk about my body, it feels extended in 3D space. I can feel inside and on the surface of my body. I know where my feet are located. I can feel, the spatial properties of the extendedness, the extension of my body. But if I talk about my I don't know, gustatory experience, taste is, yeah, it's in my mouth, but it's a different sense of spatialness. And there must be a reason, I assume, why one feels this way and the other one feels that way. And just knowing that my so much sensory experience is characterized by extendedness and my gustatory experience is not, is in a sense an amazing result of phenomenology and also neuroscience, because we investigated the neural bases and the neural substrates and neural correlates of these contents of experience. But now we can ask the question, why? And to go back to your question, what should a theory of consciousness really provide? I think it should provide an explanation to this type of why questions.
Yeah, exactly. We shouldn't be fooled by the surface level why question, because we're trying to get at the why question that goes beyond just saying, well, because because the retina was activated in this and that way, or because this area of the brain was engaged or something. That's the reason why. But we're going in a deeper sense, which, let's say, scratches our itch of explanation, right? That really says, but yeah, why? Not only as you said, why does this spatial experience feel the way it does? But answering that would also have to say why it doesn't feel like something else, right? And there has to be some cohesive way of making sense of why it feels like a spatial experience and not like a olfactory experience of lavender or something like that. So it's a much deeper why question that we're getting at when we ask this, right? Why specific experiences feel the way they do. So
any other things that we expect from a theory of consciousness?
Yeah, and maybe we could engage a little bit with this, with the question of prediction and explanation. That good theories, I think a standard measure of a theory is often its ability to predict, especially in an empirical setting, to set up testable predictions that you can somehow implement in a laboratory. Another aspect of a theory is that it should be able to explain, let's say, things that we already know, right? Facts about the brain that we already know, or about consciousness that maybe are established already, etc. So would either of you like to go deeper into that, of also this being a criterion of a good theory, of having predictive power and also explanatory power?
Well, I think a scientific theory is only a scientific theory if it has explanatory power, is my first take on it. So you need to actually explain something for it to be scientific in any way. Now, good explanatory theories will generally provide predictive power, meaning that if you have this explanatory knowledge, if you can explain why, for example, an electron reacts to a proton in a certain way, then you can predict how an electron placed in the vicinity of a proton is going to behave. And this is by virtue of having that explanatory power. So I think, the basic foundational requirement of a scientific theory is that it needs to provide explanatory power for the phenomenon that you are interested in. In this case, it's consciousness, so you need to have explanatory power for why conscious experiences feel the way they do, and why the systems that have conscious experiences have them in the first place. So I think first and foremost you need explanatory power. If you have explanatory power, it should also come with some sort of predictive power. Now, whether or not it's easy to make or test predictions is a different story, especially in consciousness science. You can, at least I think, you cannot directly access the conscious experience of other beings. So when you apply your theory, you have to assume, for example, that if I were to test my theory on Matteo, I would have to trust what he says he experiences, he actually does experience, or that something along those lines. I can't directly access Matteo's conscious experience and sidestep the requirement for requiring to trust something else, some measurement of it, either by trusting my brain scans or by trusting what he says or something. But yeah, you have this problem of indirect access to the phenomenon that you're making predictions about.
On the topic of explanatory power and predictive power, I also think it's usually underappreciated that there's a lot of knowledge that we have gathered through investigations of, for instance, deficits and lesions. So if you think about it, both psychology, neuroscience, a lot of it started with just study of deficits. So you have neuropsychology, psychopathology, neurology. So we have a lot of evidence of what goes wrong if you lesion this part of the brain or the other. But the reason why that's the effect, the question why is actually unanswered. And I know that most of the time when people think about having a theory of consciousness, they think, well, because there's all these predictions that are very important. So for instance, are other animals conscious, or can computers become conscious? All these questions about systems that we don't know very well are, of course, very important, and being able to make predictions is important. But I also think explaining why some specific dysfunction or deficit in the way, for instance, I don't know, some circuits in the brain behave results in this type of effect on consciousness that is, in this sense, it would be more of an explanation, but it's an important one. It just means that our theory is actually explaining facts that we stumbled upon, but we don't have an explanation for.
Right. You could say that, you could say yesterday's predictions have become today's explanations also, right? So there should be so we shouldn't only be looking ahead, so to speak, to making the newest, whatever new prediction based on single unit recording and whatever else. Like, we don't have to only be looking forward, but there's already this huge data bank of information that we know about the brain, and we have to be able to retrospectively, if you like, account for all of that, all of these facts that we know.
Yeah, and just to name some, just out of curiosity, I always think about the fact that clearly for IIT, well, Giulio has mentioned many times the well-known fact that the cerebellum seems to be not really important for consciousness, even though it has almost 70% of the neurons that compose the brain. And yet, so being the substrate of consciousness is not really just a matter of numbers. And that's a fact that is really puzzling if you think about it, and needs to be explained. And also some other facts for me that are very interesting are, we know that there are some conditions, like for instance, when some subjects report synesthesia, when they experience that contents of one modality come with an experience of another modality, like you can have color sound synesthesia, you can have synesthesia, for instance, when you see a number, a color comes to mind, or when you hear a specific note, a color comes to mind. And we don't really know what the neural explanation is, but having a theory that accounts for that, even if it's a well-known fact, would be very interesting. Similarly, something like why TMS to the frontal lobes helps with depression, or a lot of things that happen in schizophrenia. These are all facts that we have studied, but we really don't have a model for or an account for. And theories of consciousness might shed light on this and help us explain these phenomena.
I think they must know. I mean, if there are facts, as in, in order to be, if you are a theory of consciousness, you should really at least provide some sort of explanation for things that are known facts.
Okay, so taking stock for a minute, we have talked about consciousness, what we mean by it. We've talked about what a theory of consciousness should do, what kinds of questions a theory of consciousness should be able to answer. And now we'd like to shift into thinking about how IIT actually tries to answer these questions, right? How does IIT construct its account of consciousness? And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we're going to have to deal with a few, let's say, technical terms and things that IIT uses, but we have promised one another that we are staying out of the weeds as best we can. IIT has lots of special uses of terms and so on, not because we like inventing words, but because sometimes we simply have new concepts that we have to label with something. And we also have lots of math and so on. We're also going to promise to not get into that stuff. But we want to give this high-level overview of how IIT goes about answering these questions that we've laid out. So if you're looking at this on the wiki, you're able to click on these different numbers and you'll get a little text explanation of these different steps. But we are going to do it without any text, just zooming in on different pieces of this graphic one at a time. So in IIT, right, as we mentioned before, it's indubitably true that we're having an experience right now. And if we take a moment to look at our experience, right, to introspect, we can notice that it has certain properties. So would one of you guys like to guide us through, how we do this exactly?
I think it's useful to consider, again, like, given that the phenomenon that this theory is about is consciousness, it's a good idea to get a precise handle on what we really mean when we talk about consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. What are the properties of this thing, or if, for lack of a better term, that is the experience that you're currently having? And the approach of IIT is to kind of isolate what it calls essential properties of any conceivable experience, meaning what are the properties that needs to be there in order for something to be an experience. It tries to figure out what are these essential properties and kind of line them up so that we have a set of properties that are true of any experience you could possibly have. These properties in IIT turn out or are called axioms, and it is kind of forms the basis for the theory, meaning that you kind of, once you have characterized these properties that any experience must have in order to be an experience, then you have like a starting point for how you can build your scientific account. And in order to get at these essential properties, you need to introspect. You need to start from the only experience that you know exists, which is your own, which is kind of starting from where the cart left off. And you say, okay, so my experience exists, or there is something here now. What is it about this here and now? What more can I say about this here and now?
So Bjorn, you use this phrase that we do this for any conceivable experience. What do you mean by that word?
Well, it's any possible experience, any experience that one could possibly have, or any subject could possibly have.
So it also covers what an octopus could conceivably have, or what a bat could conceivably have.
I don't think the experience of an octopus is part of the conceivable experiences we're talking about here. I think we're a little more humble. At the beginning, we're just saying, well, we know our experience, we have direct access to it, and of course we can, based on all the experiences we had in the past, we know that there's some experiences that are conceivable even if we haven't had them, right? I can conceive of seeing a pink elephant even though I've never seen a pink elephant, right? But this is still my experience. I think the idea of IIT, and we will get to this when we get to the phase of extrapolation, is that if we characterize the experience of adult human beings using the method of IIT, then this will allow us to generalize beyond what we can actually play with to begin with, which is human beings, right? So that was just a clarification about the conceivability of an experience of an octopus. We don't know. At that point, we would have to trust the theory. But for our experience, we know what experiences are possible, because actually we know which ones are not only possible, but they're actual because we have them. And then we know which experiences are conceivable. And based on this, we can ask the question, what are the properties that seem to be always true of these experiences, both the possible and the conceivable ones? And this is the attempt to get to the essential properties of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, like we mentioned before, the essential properties are common to every experience, but then every experience might actually differ from all others because the contents of experience are different. So we could be having an experience of images and sounds, and then we can have a different experience after a little while where we're not seeing anything, we're not hearing anything, but maybe we are experiencing the taste of coffee or wine. So these are different experiences. The contents are different.
Right. So the first step is to say, what do all of these have in common? And maybe to take a step back, a way I like to think about this is we have to be clear with our listeners that this is not the explanation yet, right? You can think of this as we're homing in on what it is exactly that we're trying to explain, right? We're trying to characterize this thing called experience, or this thing called consciousness. If we just say consciousness, right, it's reified in such coarse terms. We actually have to say they're properties that we specifically need to account for if we account for the full thing called consciousness. And to draw a crude analogy, which I'm sure will break down faster than I want, if we had no idea what water is, right? We say, okay, we've got this thing that we can observe in the world. It's already a wrong analogy because, of course, this is an extrinsic object in the world versus the intrinsicness of experience. But in any case, so if you have water in the world that you observe, you say, I want to know what this thing is. Well, a first step to doing that, or to constructing your explanation, is to say, what are all the different properties that water has, right? I want to notice that it freezes at 0 Celsius and boils at 100 and forms certain lattice-like structures when it freezes, and whoever knows what else it does. I'm going to identify all the different properties it has, and then the theory that I construct is going to have to be able to account for all of those individual properties, right? Some of which are, I think the essential accidental thing might not work with the water example, but in any case, in this step of using introspection, right, looking at our experience, trying to identify its properties, what we're doing is really trying to get a really precise look at this object of study, actually, for lack of a better word, right, which is subjectivity itself, trying to say, what are all the ins and outs of this thing that we now have to try to account for? And so we first do that with essential properties. And just to draw on this picture for 1 second, that's what these 5 little sub illustrations are showing, because we end up with 5 different properties, which we say these are essential properties of any conceivable experience. We're not going to go into them in this episode, but that's just what those symbolically are representing here. There are 1 or 2 other things that we should clarify, which are words that we have on the slide here. Introspect, I think we've said probably clearly enough, or at least it's been implied, right? Introspection means you yourself having an experience, you look at that experience and you try to then articulate aspects of it that you notice, right, as properties. And we also use this word phenomenal a few different times. And maybe it's probably we're so used to using this that we take it for granted. But sometimes the word phenomenal is used differently. If someone says a phenomenon, in fact, you could say we're using it in the original Kantian sense, which is about the referring to subjectivity, right, to experience on the inside. But in regular parlance, when people talk about a phenomenon, it's often something on the outside. So when we talk about anything phenomenal, we're always referring. It's a more or less synonymous with experiential. Anything else to say about those words and how we use them?
Well, I would like to say something about the fact that we describe experience as a phenomenal structure, right? Mm-hmm. Why do we say structure? And I think this is an important term because we are going to show that according to IIT, experience is structured, and we have to explain it, account for it, also using a different kind of structure, in this case, a structure that we can define physically. And this might sound strange to call experience a phenomenal structure, but actually it is, I think, kind of intuitive. And maybe one way to see why is that when we are asked to describe experience, we usually refer to its contents. And there seem to be, most of the time, more than one content. For instance, we have a number of sensory modalities. We see images, we hear sounds, and we see colors and shapes and objects. And the colors and the shapes and the objects are also related to each other. And also the contents of one modality and another modality are also related to each other. So by structure, what we mean is that experience can be described as having components. In this case, I'm really using the term very loosely to mean anything that can be identified or distinguished within a single moment of experience. And these components are also related to each other. So this seems to be important and seems to characterize most experiences we can describe. And therefore, we can describe experience as a phenomenal structure and account for the fact that it is this way, it is a structure.
Yeah, I think like a simple, you already mentioned this or this kind of thing, but as just concrete example, like if you have a visual experience or experience with visual content, you can imagine having a red square on the right and a blue triangle on the left, for example, just in front of you. Now, if you compare that to what did I say? A red square on the left and a blue triangle on the right. These could have the exact same contents, right? But the only thing that is different is that now, these two objects or these two shapes have changed their relation to the rest of the experience. And this kind of indicates that in order to get at what the phenomenal experience or the experience is like, you kind of have to refer to how all of these contents are structured in one relative to the other. And so for me, that's an intuitive way to think about it, that if you just have two experiences that have the same, if you just have a bag of contents, so to speak, you lose something, right? You're not actually describing the experience properly. You need to say something about how all of these contents are structured, how they are related to one another, how they are stand in relation to one another.
That's a very, very good point. And you actually made me realize that maybe a good way to put it is that if I ask you, tell me about your experience, and you just say, I'm having an experience, and you don't mention anything about its content, then it seems like you're not really describing your experience. I can't try to account for it if I don't know what it is about. What are you feeling, right? But if you tell me about, so it must have some content, it must be have some components. But if you tell me something about the components, for instance, there is a red square and there is a blue triangle, but you don't tell me about the relations between these contents, these components, it is also, in a sense, I am missing some pieces. You have to describe not only that it has content, which contents, most of the time more than one, and how all these contents or its components are related. If you give me a very, very detailed description of all the contents of your experience and of how the components are related, then it seems like, is there anything that I'm missing? And now you can get to the feeling that actually, no, that's probably a good exhaustive description of an experience. And I want to remark that here by contents or components, you have to imagine you're describing anything, really. Everything that you feel, you are describing what you're seeing, what you're hearing, your emotional tone, the feeling of, the chair that you are touching with your back, and all the thoughts that you're having. So if you really give a full description of all the contents and how they're related, it seems to be an exhaustive description of an experience. And this is what we start from. On our left side, the explanandum is this phenomenal structure that characterizes experience in full. And then now we are starting with our explanation. Now we have the explanandum, we have the object that we want to explain.
And I think building Can I say one thing, building on what Matteo brought up of this? Please don't be fooled by seeing this picture of clearly only a visual experience. So we have to depict this in some way, which is visual, but we really are casting the net very broadly when we say every experience can be described as a phenomenal structure, right? No matter what the contents of that experience are, and at the same time we have to represent it somehow. So we revert to visual depictions here.
I just wanted to mention that, we put this as our first step in the IIT method. I think we haven't talked at all about this notion of IIT being phenomenology first, and that is in fact something that distinguishes it from other theories and approaches, at least being phenomenology first explicitly. And what I mean by that is that it might seem obvious, at least it seems kind of obvious to me, that in order to study and explain and account for consciousness properly, you need to really get at what conscious experiences are. So you need to really kind of try to introspect and figure out what makes an experience, what are its properties, and so on and so forth. And you need to really start with characterizing experiences fully in order to try to account for them. Mm-hmm. But I do think that this is actually a thing that IIT actually get some criticism for doing so explicitly, and it's not common in the field of consciousness science, at least. And Matteo or you both were part of a great paper talking about this. So maybe you guys can talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
or not. That's also possible.
I'm just being quiet.
I was the
last. Sure, I can. I was just because I was talking last. I was ceding the floor. But sure, I'm happy to say something. So yeah, we had a paper a few years ago called "Consciousness and the Fallacy of Misplaced Objectivity." A little bit of a tongue twister as the title. But in any case, it was attempting to clarify this approach that we have in IIT of being phenomenology first, and to contrast this a little bit with, you could say, standard approaches, which, at least in IIT's perspective, aren't really getting at the explanandum, right? The thing that needs to be explained, but are rather getting at proxies of the thing to be explained. So to be more specific about this, in neuroscience, or not only neuroscience, but in, let's say, empirical work, not only neuroscience, but also in psychology, in cognitive science, and so on, people will often study correlates, right? Whether they are neural correlates of consciousness or of experiences, or behavioral correlates, meaning what people do, and we somehow think that correlates with a certain experiential state, or what's referred to as functional correlates, which frankly it's kind of a vague concept, but different functions that are associated with conscious states. Because if you're doing empirical work, you rely on the reports of other people, right? So you have a group of experimental subjects, and in some really banal example, you'd say, click this mouse button when you see a light appear or something, right? So that's using a behavioral, well, I guess that's maybe more of a functional correlate, as a sort of proxy of saying, well, when this person clicks the mouse button, we take that to indicate that they are noticing something on a screen, and noticing something is having an experience of that thing on the screen, right? So this is some sort of a proxy way of getting at this tricky thing called experience, right? Sorry for completely straw manning experimental design, but anyway, in any case, I hope that the general idea comes across. And so a lot of studies use these different kinds of correlates, right? Neural, behavioral, functional, as the way to study this thing called consciousness, which, we should be clear, we don't think that that's bad, right? We think that you should use empirical studies and so on. But in our opinion, empirical studies should come rather at the end. Once you already have a theory of what consciousness is, as you see on our graphic here, right? You then use those kinds of studies to validate a theory that you have. But if you bring in that step too early, in this case, the way people bring that step in sometimes is that they use those correlates to substitute out the explanandum, right? The thing to be explained. So instead of actually trying to articulate the thing to be explained as phenomenal structure, right, as experience itself that has all these properties, both essential ones and accidental ones, what people do is they take these correlates, which are objective, right, which are, let's say, also more scientifically acceptable because of, you know, the aspiration of science to study objective phenomena with objective means, and they end up kind of, you know, flipping the doing a little swap there of then saying, well, we're studying experience, but what we said in this paper is that, well, you're not really studying experience, you're studying a certain proxy of experience, which ends up completely, you're getting at something else. What you're providing is an account of those proxies. You're providing an account of the correlates, which is not the same as providing an account of the experience itself. Right. So in any case, as you were saying nicely, Björn, IIT really is this phenomenology-first theory, which means that we say, wait, before doing any kind of objective work, so to speak, we actually have to start by using subjective means, namely introspection, which also includes certain executive functions such as reflection, of course, also noticing aspects of your experience, etc., to first characterize experience from the inside out, right? You have to actually apply these kinds of subjective techniques from the inside out to then construct an explanation of that, and then as a next step to then validate it, right, with the traditional experimental techniques. Matteo, I'm sure you're also an author on that paper. I'm sure you'd love to supplement it with some other observations also.
Sure. Yeah, so I want to add one thing, which is that, and maybe also be a little playful, I want to argue that no theory can really avoid being consciousness first. In a sense, IIT is special because maybe it's consciousness first and foremost, in a sense, right? It is every theory start of consciousness, at least, or who wants to say anything about the fact that consciousness is involved in a task, needs to start and does start with, for instance, asking the subject, did you see what I showed on the screen, right? So let's talk about a concrete example. We all know that if we show a bright dot on a screen, we can ask a subject, did you see it? And they say yes. And then we can ask them to move their eyes and fixate the subject. And we can design this experiment where we basically study the fact that conscious subjects are able to fixate dots on a screen. So now I want to argue that also this approach is in a sense implicitly consciousness first, because it must start by the assumption that a subject is seeing a dot on the screen and they are able to move their eyes and fixate it. But here's where the two approaches diverge. The first approach that we can call maybe more like functionalist approach stops here and just says, okay, to study the ability of consciously fixating a bright dot, all I have to do now is understand what mechanisms in the brain are activated when a subject is able to consciously see a dot and move their eyes. That's all there is to explain. And this is a valid investigation of a function that is fixation of a point. But our claim in the paper is that we shouldn't take this explanation as being a substitution for an explanation of the fact that the subject is consciously seeing a dot on a screen and it's willingly move their eyes to fixate the dot, which seems to be basically there's much more going on besides just the subject, moving their eyes. And the consciousness first approach of IIT spends much more time in describing the phenomenological aspect of what is going on here. Because, for instance, what we are saying is that we have to appreciate the fact that a subject is conscious and they are experiencing many, many things besides having just a visual experience. And then on top of that, that moving their eyes to fixate a dot on a screen actually involves seeing the screen in the first place, so having this experience of an extended canvas in front of their eyes, seeing probably colors. Let's say it's a dark screen, so seeing black everywhere in all the locations of the visual field, then seeing a bright dot that appears, then moving their eyes. So this characterization of an experience is much richer. So it starts from experience and tries to explain, to characterize it in full detail. And then it moves to asking a question, okay, now that we have a full characterization of experience, we can account for some facts, for instance, a subject moving their eyes to fixate a dot, but also the fact that this is just one function that accompanies experience. And the point of IIT is that by explaining a function of just fixating, we're not accounting for experience itself. We're accounting for a function that accompanies experience, which is a big difference.
And you said one thing that I think is worth dwelling on for a moment, which is, in fact, everybody is phenomenology first. They just don't know it, right? They don't realize it. And I think it's an important irony to point out, because IIT is often criticized for being phenomenology first, or people say that it's using subjective techniques that have no place in science, etc. Not everyone says this, but this is a kind of critique that you'll hear. But what we're trying to say, not only in this paper but more broadly, is that everybody, when you use report in any way, right? When you use experimental subjects, the reason that you trust the report is because you yourself, as the experimenter, know what it is to have an experience. This is also a point, by the way, that you've made often, Björn, coming from the neuroscientific side. I don't know if you have any richness to add to that. I feel as if you've also debated colleagues on this point and so on, and struggled to have them see what you mean by this. But it's actually such a crucial point to get across, that we're doing a step that's done implicitly elsewhere, and we're trying to be very explicit about it. And then in trying to be explicit, we get criticized for doing it, and with people not recognizing that they're also doing it, but just not in a complete way.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to the issue of trying to be very data-driven or theory agnostic in your work. It's like some people think that that's like the scientific standard, right? Of not, being so theory-driven or so ideological, or only focusing on one thing. But it's kind of just like the fact that you don't have an explicit theory when you try to interpret results doesn't mean that you're theory free. It just means that you are not aware of which theory you're using, or that you're just using intuition or something along the lines. And I think the similar sort of issue is present here, that either you're explicitly phenomenology first, meaning that you're explicitly going in and you're characterizing the thing that you're trying to account for, or explain or predict, which is the experience, and you're starting from that. Or you're just implicitly doing the same thing, or you're just like using your intuitive understanding of what experiences are, just like you talked about, when you see a red square, I know how that feels. So if I flash a red square on this screen, then, I can assume that, if they say they see it, it's accompanied by an experience in there. And I already know what that feels like. So I don't need to do any further work on it. It's kind of like, yeah, I don't really know. I don't have much to add. I just wanted to say that it's a similar type of problem. Just because you don't make it explicit doesn't mean that it's not there.
Right. Okay, so I'd suggest we move on to our next step here.
Yes.
So we have step number 1, introspecting phenomenal properties, trying to characterize phenomenal structure. And as we mentioned, we first do this with essential properties. And our next step is formulating these phenomenal properties in physical terms. So like in the previous step, we use introspection to notice both essential and accidental properties, right? Accidental is a fancy way of saying properties that are present in some experiences but not present in others. And we do this formulate step also for essential and accidental. I think in this first pass we'll focus more on the essential piece of it, but in any case you can just notice that it tracks one-to-one what we did in the previous step. All right, so there's quite a lot to unpack here. Maybe I would suggest we give Björn the reins on this. If if you're up for it.
This step is about trying to make, the essential properties that we found in the previous step, how to make them, scientifically approachable, so to speak, right? So let's say we had these 5 essential properties that I think you briefly mentioned, Jeremiah. That is true for every conceivable experience according to IIT. Now, the goal then is to say, okay, well, that's all talk about phenomenology and experiences and so on and so forth. How can we formulate this in a way that is scientifically actionable, how that we can do something about and use for something and start structuring our explanation? And to get here, there's also actually a few explicitly made assumptions that goes into, metaphysical assumptions that IIT makes explicit in order to be able to formulate these essential properties in a way that is actionable and useful in scientific practice. But basically,
wait, one word I would just fix there. I think you said metaphysical assumptions. I think you want to say methodological assumptions, because metaphysical would be much more grand than that. No? Do you disagree?
Sure. No, we can go for methodological. I think that in itself
I think it's probably better.
Sure. I think that in itself is a metaphysical statement, but that's okay. And then that's fine. And just to say that, physics is operational is a pretty strong metaphysical claim, I think. But anyways, well,
can you say, without going into details, I think the idea you said metaphysical because from having an experience and introspecting its properties, we also move a step further and we say, okay, we assume that there is an external world out there, that it exists, and that it's made of things that interact causally, among which our brains, it seems like our brains and our experiences are related, right? Tightly related. So I guess that's what the idea is. It's metaphysical assumptions about stuff that exists outside of our experience. And now we want to build an explanation in terms of brains that uses the terminology of causal interactions.
But we try to be as parsimonious as possible, is what I was also trying to get at. They're saying, if someone hears metaphysical assumption, they can, let's say they can misconstrue what we mean by that. We try to be as as Matteo says, from within experience, what are the minimal assumptions I need to make to get science off the ground, right? To get some kind of an explanation off the ground.
Yeah, that's fair. And well taken. And I agree. And kind of the goal here is then to say, okay, given that we assume that we're part of a greater universe and we can use causal language, for example, to create explanations in physical terms, then we could say, well, okay, now let's try to do that for consciousness, for my experience, this experience that I'm having right here and right now. Now, in order to get anywhere with that sort of experience, with an explanation of why I'm having this particular experience, why it feels this particular way to be me right now, I need to, or the approach of IIT is to say, well, let's just go one by one for each of these essential properties that we found for the experience, and let's say, well, let's translate each one of them and say, any physical thing, whatever it may be, if I talk about it in causal terms, it needs to kind of have all of these same properties in order for it to be the physical substrate of that particular experience. One way that I like to think about it is the kind of the assumption here, or I guess we'll get to the conjecture of the identity later, but still, I think it's useful to talk about here that it's the way what it feels like to be in phenomenal terms somehow needs to be reflected in the way it feels to be in physical terms. So if the thing that you're you're describing physically has all the same properties as the phenomenal thing, your experience, then it's a reasonable starting point for constructing an explanation for why that thing feels the way it does.
I would like to offer maybe just an analogy that I find interesting for what you just said, which is that going back to Jeremiah's example of water, if I touch water and I describe its property, I say, oh, it looks transparent, it looks liquid, I touch it, it can be cold, it can be hot. Let's take this, the temperature of water that I feel. Okay, there's something I feel, which is phenomenal. I feel about water, it's hot. And if I want to give a description of water in physical terms, I have to account for the fact that, well, it feels hot. What does this mean in terms of the water itself, right? And I will end up developing a theory of mean kinetic energy and temperature, etc. So now, by analogy, a similar procedure can be applied to my experience. And in this case, I'm not experiencing the temperature of water, which is something different from me, but I'm saying I have an experience which seems to be, for instance, it's integrated. It's always one experience, right? And if it is true that the substrate, the physical substrate of my experience is a part of my brain, then what is the physical explanation of the fact that my experience feels one in terms of the properties of its substrate? So in this case, I'm using my experience and asking what is the physical property that corresponds to this essential property of my experience, and so on and so forth for all the other essential properties that we haven't listed yet, but we will get into the details, and also of all the accidental properties. So I can ask the question, if I'm seeing a red square, well, what is in physical terms that at least corresponds to this experience of a red square that I can point at, that is going on in the physical world, in this case, in a part of my brain that you can also observe. You can't observe my experience of a red square, but you can should be able to observe the neural substrate of my experience of a red square.
Okay, so what are we looking at in the way we depict this? And I'll try to describe it in a way that listeners can follow easily. So when we say that we formulate phenomenal properties in physical terms, physical, we should say, just means causal, right? It just means I can poke something and see that something happens. We're not making assumptions of the standard model of physics or anything else. And the way we often represent this notion of physical is simply as units that are that have causes and effects on one another. So what I'm looking at here is a network of 6 different units: A, B, C, D, I, and O. I and O were chosen to sort of indicate, input and output. It's not that we can't follow the alphabet. And so we've got these 6 units, and we'd say, well, if I poke A, I see that when I turn A on, for example, whatever that means, it does something to B. It also turns B on, right? Or might also be that when I turn A on, it actually makes B stay off, right? It has some suppressing, causal relationship. So when we say we formulate phenomenal properties in physical terms, it means properties of a substrate of units. And as Björn was saying at the beginning, we're trying to come up with, for each of the essential properties we identified, some way of thinking about the properties of these 6 units, or maybe a subset of those 6 units, that matches in a one-to-one sense the phenomenal property, right, that we identified on the left side. We're going to go into lots of detail on what exactly these properties are in future episodes. But I think the only important term to bring in is just to say they're called the postulates of IIT. So we mentioned this word axiom at the beginning. Axiom is basically synonymous with this word essential property of experience. And then on the physics side, we then use this word postulate, where we say, well, for each axiom, we try to formulate it in physical terms as a postulate, right? So from the axiom, we postulate a certain physical property that should correspond one to one.
Yeah, and I guess from that we end up with a set of postulates where, some of them will help us indicate what is the substrate of consciousness, meaning what are the boundaries, what's in and what's out. Is it all of the brain or only parts of it for the human case, for example? Or is it the whole body for that matter? Or is it not the nervous system at all? Given the facts that we know about the relation between consciousness and the brain, it's likely to be some part of the brain. Here we have highlighted the so-called posterior parts of the brain, which have certain properties that are, according to IIT, makes it more likely to be the substrate of consciousness. And it's also, there are suggestions or support for this idea in the empirical literature, but it's by no means undisputed. But anyways, it's here. It's kind of this blue outline shows on the upper picture and in part also on the lower picture, kind of this, and I guess of where, the theory might predict that the substrate of consciousness is to be found in the humans. And then you have this colorful blob popping out of it on the top there, which is the Φ-structure, or what should I say, the full characterization here, just visually indicated as a colorful blob. But this is supposed to kind of be full characterization of the causal properties, I would say, or the causes and effects within the substrate, meaning that it is kind of a visualization of all of the causes and effects among the units and the subsets of units that make up the overall substrate of consciousness.
So Jeremiah said that the characterization we give, the formulation in physical terms, is purely in terms of causal properties, causal interactions, causes and effects, and that this is supposed to be, so to speak, neutral in terms of current physics. I want to stress that it is neutral, but it is not incompatible with any current physics. What we are trying to say here is that currently we think that neurons are responsible for let's say the activity at the level of neurons or mini columns or sets of neurons is relevant for consciousness, and that the way in which neurons interact, which is through chemical and electrical signals, well, that's the way in which causation is happening. So the causal interactions are mediated through action potentials and synapses and release of chemicals. But really what matters is the way in which the neurons causally interact. And the language of cause, effect, power, or causation in terms of IIT can be mathematized precisely to be, so to speak, agnostic about what is mediating these causal interactions. We could discover maybe in the future that there is also some causal interaction that is mediated by some quantum phenomena, or it could even be in principle dark energy, anything we can imagine. But the point here is that our physical formulation of the phenomenal properties of consciousness is in terms of something we can observe and describe in causal terms. And if you think about it, the physical world is really, what can we use as a description of the physical world if not causal terms? That's the only thing we can use, right? We can observe changes, we can produce changes by manipulating and then observing the effects of our manipulations, and we can describe these changes with the language of causality. And on top of that, we can, of course, mathematize all this. We can talk about probabilities, for instance, of something happening when we do something else. We can talk about the probability of a unit, which is generically defined, of changing state. So what I'm trying to say here is that the formulation in physical properties of IIT is really very general and abstract in pure terms of causation, that in this case is described through the language of mathematics, probabilities, things changing state, things causally interacting with each other. And when we look at this substrate model and the Φ structure, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about sets of causal interactions, or actually more like causal constraints, or information about causal interactions that some units being in a state specify about some other units being some other states. That's a very general overview of what we're looking at.
Yeah, so can we move to step 3 with this? I think we can.
Yes, well, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to highlight that, like we talked about a phenomenal structure, here we're talking about a phi structure, because again, we want to address this structural nature of consciousness. We said that a good way to describe an experience is in terms of contents and the way they are related to each other, basically a structural description. And it's very natural to then hypothesize that if we can describe experience in physical terms, that we will have to use a similar explanation talking about a structure. In this case, it's not a structure of contents of experience, but it is a structure of causal, let's say, components. And like Jeremiah said, causes and effects of sets of units that constitute the substrate of consciousness, or in the language of IIT, causal distinctions and relations that correspond to phenomenal distinctions and relations.
In fact, Matteo, I advanced the slide here because I think you're already moving in this direction nicely. Why don't you continue to tell us a bit about step 3 here? As you're saying, this from step 2, the outcome that we're going for is this phi structure, right? This, or cause-effect structure, we should also say, it's a synonym for phi structure. So you might hear us say cause-effect structure sometime. It's meaning this big blob here with lots of colors. So continue telling us, Matteo, about this relationship between the phenomenal structure and the phi structure, and tell us about how this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of explaining, or maybe a better word here is probably accounting for experience.
Right. So the reasoning of IIT goes as follows. We describe the phenomenal structure in detail, then we attempt to formulate all the properties that we have characterized in physical terms using the language of causation and mathematics. And in this case, we conjecture that if we take the substrate of experience, the physical substrate of experience, and we actually look at all its causal properties, then we will find something that, if the theory is correct, should account for every content of experience that we have described in the first step. So the final step is to say, well, if everything works correctly, what we can do is that we can establish that there is an identity between this phenomenal structure and the phi structure, or the cause-effect structure. And what we mean by there is an identity, we really mean that everything that we can observe in phenomenology has correspondence in some causal property of its physical substrate, and everything that we can observe as a causal property of the physical substrate accounts for a piece of our experience. And we like to say that this is an explanatory identity, just to clarify that it should be clear by now, but we're not trying to argue that experience is really just a set of causal constraints. We're not trying to reduce experience or consciousness to some physical property. We're not claiming that we really don't have any experience. Whatever exists is just a set of physical interactions. What we're trying to say is that what we experience from within in the first person, if we look at it with the language or through the lens of physical measurable properties, looks like a set of causal properties of a physical substrate. And conversely, what looks like a set of causal properties of a physical substrate, it feels like something from within. So we can use the third person lens and perspective of us looking at a brain in this case, and we can know that it feels like something to be that brain in that state, because a set of causal properties are there. And this is, of course, if the theory is correct, if the formulation is correct, if our characterization of the essential and accidental properties of consciousness is correct. That's what the theory is trying to achieve.
Right. And in this depiction that we have here, we've added two other words that we use in IIT. We won't go into a lot of detail on them, but just to give a bit of an intuition pump for what we're showing here. On the left side, we say that any phenomenal structure has bits of it that you can distinguish. And we call these distinctions, right? A term that we use. So in a really coarse sense, you could say, okay, the hand here, where I can distinguish that. Okay, let's call that a distinction. In reality, it'd be a mix of lots of different distinctions, but in any case, we can, for the sake of brevity, say, okay, I can distinguish the hand. I'll call it a distinction. And that is related to other distinctions in very particular ways, right? We call these relations. So for example, the hand and the book are related. They have a certain overlap in my experience. And then if we see in this sort of crude schema that we've given here, the conjecture here in this step that IIT is making is that there should be this one-to-one correspondence in a very concrete way, right? A very exact way between every distinction that I pick out of my experience and what we call causal distinctions that are what comprise the phi structure or the cause-effect structure through the relations that those distinctions have with one another. So clearly here we're just showing this schematically, right, to just give this feeling for what we mean by this one-to-one identity correspondence. But a lot of, as we'll see in later episodes and throughout the wiki, a lot of the heavy lifting of IIT has been really articulating what we mean by these concepts, right? There's a lot of math behind determining what exactly comprises a causal distinction among units or subsets of units, and how exactly do we determine how these distinctions relate to then form, right, this thing we call the phi structure.
So to preempt just some misunderstandings, I think you already said something like this, but there is a little bit of a oversimplification here for the sake of showing a neat correspondence between phenomenal distinctions and phenomenal relations with causal distinctions and causal relations. However, reality is that when we introspect in phenomenology, of course, we can highlight the fact that there are contents, and some of the contents of our experience are, let's say, more coarse-grained and some are very, very fine. So for instance, if I see a red square, this is a content of experience. I could be calling it a distinction because it's something I can distinguish. But the truth is that I could zoom in and focus on the fact that what is a red square that I'm experiencing is actually a set of little specks of red colored. I can imagine the smallest possible pixel of red color I can see in my visual field. That's actually something that I can, in principle, isolate. And then maybe there is a contour, etc. So those are also distinctions, right? Those are also things that I can distinguish. And when we go to the physical side, actually we also have to account for this variety of levels, let's say, of generality of distinctions. So we have very, very small distinctions that correspond to the smallest possible components of my experience I can name and I can distinguish. And then we have something much bigger, which is, for instance, a set of distinctions and relations, maybe more like a substructure of my experience that corresponds to an entire substructure of a cause-effect structure. So here we are, of course, simplifying just to give a general picture, but then we will get into the details of all this later.
Yeah, and again, this is I think correctly characterized as a conjecture made by the theory, right? That what it's like to be phenomenally can be fully accounted for without any added ingredients by what it is like to be the physical substrate in physical terms, right? So by fully characterizing what the physical substrate is to itself, physically speaking, we have the best guess, so to speak. We have the best explanation for why it feels the way it does phenomenally from its own first-person perspective.
And maybe a few caveats should be given around this term explanatory identity. So what are the typical ways that this can be misunderstood? Because it's not a standard term to say explanatory identity. It does exist in some philosophical literature, but usually when people talk about identity theories, you don't have this this caveat of explanatory identity. And I would say what I've seen as the biggest misunderstandings would be first, that people think we're talking about an isomorphic relationship between two different things, right? You've got this phenomenon. This is more or less it has a hint of dualism, right? To think in those terms, which IIT does not want to do. And the reason I say this is with if you think of it as an isomorphism, you say, okay, you've got this phenomenal world, and then you've got the physical world, and somehow these are they reflect each other one-to-one in some isomorphic way. But of course, the problem then becomes you have the need for what sometimes has been called a bridging principle or something. And you say, no, we don't want to get into that. It's not how we see it in an ontological sense, as if they're two different things that are somehow mysteriously bridged and connected, right? So that's one possible misunderstanding. Another one is perhaps a reductive misunderstanding, which is what Matteo was saying at the beginning, which is important, I think, to emphasize again. When we offer this identity relationship, we're by no means saying an experience is nothing but its phi structure, right? This is like the crude shorthand of saying of this way of thinking about a reductive relationship. And the reason IIT tries to avoid that so much, or does avoid it, is that's putting the cart before the horse again. If you say, oh, now that we've started with phenomenology, but now at the end of the game, we then sort of pull the rug out from experience and say, oh, what's really there is this physical thing called a phi structure, right, which exists in some Platonic information space or something. No, absolutely not. We don't take that final step, because, you know, staying true to this phenomenology-first principle, there's no. So actually, let's say staying true to this Cartesian commitment of skepticism, of saying, you know, everything, I can doubt everything except for the existence of my own experience. And so if through my skeptical doubting and questioning and exploring scientifically, if I end up with an explanation, that explanation can never replace the epistemological and ontological primacy of experience itself, which is the thing I started with. So you could also say IIT is not just experience first, but also experience last, in the sense that, you know, even once we get to this explanatory identity, we never reduce it to, you know, the experience to this phenomenal structure, right? If anything, if you had to insist on something being primary, it would be, you know, the left side here, right? It would be the experience as being primary. And this may be, to finish my rant here, this maybe helps shed light on what we mean by explanatory identity here, where we say, well, it may also be an ontological identity, but who am I from within my experience to know that, right? I'm not God. I'm a scientist doing my work from within my experience. I'm sure about my experience. And I think a reasonable explanation of this experience is this identity relationship.
And I think just also to mention on this possible misunderstanding, so to speak, I think we should be just open about the fact that this, what's it called, prefix explanatory is relatively new, right? It's a clarification in the latest version of the theory, and the identity has been called different things in the past, but it has been supposed to be an explanatory identity all along, as far as I've understood. And I think this is a step in the right direction to try to avoid in the future these kinds of misunderstandings, right? To be explicit that we are the structure, phi structure, is an explanation of the thing that is what should I say, truly there, which is the experience, right?
Okay, so moving on to step 4. So in step 4, we don't have words here on the slide to say what we're doing, but we're just going to describe it, which is we're essentially iterating through what we just did, but now instead of doing it for the essential properties of experience, we're going to do it for the accidental properties of experience. So just to remind, an accidental property of experience is a property that's there in some experiences, but not there in other experiences. So the prototypical example would be something like color, right? You have some experiences that have the color red as part of the experience and others that don't. And so these are accidental properties. And we've depicted it in this way because it's very useful to think of this kind of cycle, right, through these steps as a something that you iterate on multiple times. The first step is somehow unique, or the first pass, let's say, is somehow unique in that we're looking at it. This is where we're really building the theory and coming to this conjecture of the explanatory identity. And we do that with the essential properties, right? So that step, that iteration is indeed unique to get the explanatory apparatus, let's say, in front of us, right, to work with. But if that just stays as a conjecture, it might be interesting, but it doesn't really scratch your itch of explanation if you can't start answering questions with it, like, well, why does my experience of space feel like this? And why does my experience of an object feel like that, right? So you can think of these next passes through or iterations through as demonstrating the identity, right? By providing an account of as many different accidental properties as we can do. In fact, right? That's the goal of IIT in the end, is to, or at least in principle, IIT should be able, or the tools of IIT should be able to account for every accidental property of experience. So maybe I can invite you, Matteo, to give a 3-minute synopsis of how we do this for one experience, right? Because we've illustrated this also in the slides. And Matteo's quite close to this research. So,
okay, so consider the fact that when you're having an experience like right now, if you're looking at a screen, you are having an experience that is characterized by some visual contents. And what we're depicting here is that, imagine your experience is fully characterized by a view of the dark sky. So this is a content of experience that we want to apply the IIT method on, and we want to account for it in physical terms. So first of all, we would have to introspect the properties that characterize this content of experience that is of a visual nature. And we can, in this case, maybe we can try to abstract from the fact that there are no recognizable objects such as faces or squares or shapes or trees. We can see specks of color. We could even abstract actually from the fact that we're seeing specks of color. One important feature that we can highlight is that we are seeing an extended circle, and there is a region of space that contains, in this case, some differences in brightness. But the fact that it is extended is definitely a qualitative aspect that we want to account, and we have to account. So the IIT methodology is applied just like we did before for this accidental property, the extendedness of our visual field. And in this case, when we formulate these properties in physical terms, we are asking not which substrate of which physical substrate is responsible for the fact that there is an experience in the first place, but which substrate is responsible for the specific aspect that we have highlighted. In this case, the extendedness.
When you say which substrate, what do you mean by which substrate there?
So I mean which subset of the substrate of consciousness is responsible or is contributing to our experience, this subset of the contents. So in this case, like Jeremiah is highlighting, is pointing with the mouse, we know actually that visual cortex it's called visual cortex because we know that it is responsible for visual contents of our experience. And in particular, the IIT explanation proposes that the grid-like architecture of visual cortex is responsible for the feeling of extendedness of our visual field and our visual experience.
But it's worth clarifying, if I can say, I mean, bringing us back to the why questions that we talked about in the beginning, right? You know, I could say, why does space feel the way it does? And one way to answer that why question is say, well, because it's doing this in visual cortex. It's like, wait, okay, we knew that already. Thank you. We didn't need a new paper to tell us that. But what IIT's why question is getting at is, well, the answer lies in the phi structure or the substructure, right, which we're indicating up here, which means there are very particular ways that the units down here are causally constrain one another. And we can identify properties in the way those causal constraints work. And those properties we're able to actually identify or able to show that they correspond one-to-one with the specific phenomenal properties, which we identify through our characterization of what space feels like, right, on the left-hand side.
Yeah, exactly. So the general idea is that we account for the fact that visual experience is characterized by this feeling of extendedness by looking at the substrate, in this case, portion of posterior cortex, visual cortex. We look at its architecture, which is depicted on the right side of the cause effect structure. We have this little inset. We know that the connectivity in that area of the brain is characterized by lateral connections, a lattice-like 2D sort of grid. And we can ask the question, okay, why this architecture, if we look at it through the lens of phenomenology, feels like space? And now here's really where the expansion of IIT is sort of tested, in a sense, in providing an explanation, because the way in which, like Jeremiah said, the way in which the various mechanisms that constitute this part of the substrate causally constrain each other has properties that we can describe in causal terms that correspond one-to-one to the properties of the components of our visual experience. And I invite the listeners to check out some other episodes where we get into the nitty-gritty of the account of space that IIT provides, or to consult the 2019 paper by Andrew Hahn and Giulio Tononi. The general idea is that characterizing the essential properties of space, in this case, the ones that characterize space and make it feel the way it does, can be done in phenomenological terms. And then the causal properties of the grid-like substrate that contribute the experience of space can be characterized in causal terms. And then the explanatory identity between these causal properties and the accidental properties can now be evaluated for the experience of space that characterizes visual experience, but also somatosensory experience. And we can also apply the same methodology to account for other contents of experience, such as the feeling of the flow of time, the fact that we not only see space, but we actually see objects such as faces or trees. And that here by objects, we really just mean we feel that contents of experience are instances of a class. When I see a face, I recognize that it is a specific face, but I also feel it's just a face. And similarly, when I hear, for instance, a chord, I hear that it is a musical chord, but it also feels like a major chord, regardless whether it is a C major or a D major. And then we also plan to apply the same methodology to account for what we call local qualities. In this case, we could be talking about color, pitch, characterizing sound, but also the feeling of temperature on the skin, touch, taste, eventually also some types of pain, any type of property that is, well, really characterizing a sort of atomic content of experience.
Okay, great. So that was step 4. And we've given this one example of space. So let's move then to step 5, right? After we've characterized as many different possible, accidental properties, finally, we move to this validation step, we then aim to validate empirically in adult humans, meaning people, not only adults, by the way, it could also be, but especially adult humans in the sense that they can reliably report their experiences. I think we add this word adult human to indicate that you have to do, it can't be with fetuses or newborn babies or something, to do the first steps of the empirical validation, because it's essential that that someone can report their experience to confirm whether or not they're actually having having one. So Björn, maybe I can invite you, since you're the closest to this work. Can you give us just a taste of how IIT goes about doing empirical validation?
I think at first it's useful to be very open about the fact that IIT is a relatively intricate theory to apply in full, meaning that validating the theory kind of at its core is going to be hard work, right? And so I think we should just be open about the fact that validating the theory is a long-term thing, but I think you can have some core ideas be tested to see if they kind of do in fact fit with what we know about consciousness in human beings. So one thing is to kind of just establish, that these essential properties that we didn't really list, but that are supposed to be there for any substrate of consciousness, holds up in what should I say, typical cases where we say that humans lose consciousness, or at least that the consciousness fades, that it's radically reduced in some quantitative way, that we can find some measure that we can apply in humans.
And I can just say that the bottom part of this graphic is illustrating what Björn is getting at here, where we're first aiming to identify what's the neural substrate of consciousness as a whole, right?
Yeah, so the essential, so two of the essential properties in IIT, both on the phenomenal side in axioms and on the postulate side on the physical side in the postulates, are named information and integration, and these have been used to generate an interesting measure where you take what is called a TMS machine, or a machine that is able to interact with the brain directly with magnetic fields to activate the brain cells directly. And this methodology has been shown or used to show that these properties of integration and differentiation seems to break down when you apparently lose consciousness, which is kind of a neat validation of these principles of IIT, which we'll get back to when we talk more in detail about the postulates and how they're formulated. But they are explicitly saying that you need both integration and information in order to be a substrate of consciousness. And if the brain loses its integration and or information capacity in states where we are, at least to the best of our knowledge, losing consciousness, then this seems to be a good validation of the theory on experimental grounds. And this has been shown over and over in many different cases that it seems to be the case, and you start getting these hints that the theory is onto something, not because the theory after the fact kind of is accommodated to this empirical finding, but because the theory itself brought about the prediction that these properties should be reduced, for example, in unconscious states. There are other ways you can validate the theory as well, I think, by using, again, our knowledge of the brain. For example, you can look at how the brain works in different parts of the brain. For example, we talked about the cerebellum earlier, saying that it doesn't seem to have much to do with our conscious experience in everyday experiences. On the other hand, the cortex, at least the posterior parts of the cortex, seems to have a lot to do with our experiences, and you can use our knowledge of the theory or of the brain to kind of understand why that is the case by relying on principles of the theory, by saying that, well, the way that the neurons are interacting or connected or even functioning in cerebellum versus the cortex give us or we get a good understanding for why the cerebellum does not contribute by relying on these principles of the theory. And also you get a good understanding of why certain parts of the cortex seem important for consciousness by relying on the principles of the theory, and our understanding of how the different constituents of the brain seem to interact. So I think the more, and if these parts of the brain that seem to have the right properties according to the theory also line up with our empirical knowledge of which parts seem to be associated with conscious processing and so on and so forth, then that's good news for the theory, so to speak, right? That you might rely on it in situations where you don't really know what the state of consciousness is.
And maybe we should just indicate briefly what we're talking about on the top part, which is, of course, we try to also empirically validate specific contents of experience. And I think Matteo basically already said a word or two about this in his explanation of space. But do either of you want to give some taste of how we would actually do some test in an empirical sense to try to see, well, is IIT's explanation of space, barking up the right tree?
Sure. So, like you said, in the previous step, we were starting from phenomenology, formulating some properties about, for instance, a content of experience, the extendedness of our experience of visual space, and then formulating this in terms of causal properties of the substrate. So now that was all, so to speak, a priori. That was all before actually going to the empirical step. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, then it should follow that we should predict how experience changes. For instance, if the substrate of the extendedness of visual space was changed either because of some lesion that might occur naturally or because of some empirical manipulation. And this is the step where we can perform the validation of the theory. We can look for instance, patients that have lesions to their visual cortex where some parts of visual cortex are lesions. So there is a scotoma, for instance, and we can look whether, since according to the theory, the experience of visual space would be changed by a lesion in visual cortex in very, very specific ways, we can look whether these patients report a change in their experience that actually matches with the prediction of the theory. And similarly, we can also design interventions that can use, for instance, learning or brain stimulation or other techniques where we can design experiments to test, in this case, the predictions of the theory. And this is already has already been done for the experience of visual space, but it will happen in the future also for other contents of experience. Is the way in which the neural substrate of the contents can be validated empirically.
Great. So as a final step, then we extrapolate beyond adult humans. Matteo, you're our philosopher. Why don't you bring us home here? And just briefly, we don't have to go into detail here, but what do we mean when we say we extrapolate, and what are we representing here with these little pictures and these phrases?
So I think we can tie it back to our original question. What do we expect from a theory of consciousness? And immediately we said, well, we expect it to tell us what is conscious in the world, in the natural world. We expect it to tell us whether a specific person is conscious or not, if, for instance, they are not giving any signs of consciousness, but we also want it to tell us whether other animals are conscious. And of course, it follows that perhaps we should have a different attitude towards them, perhaps having some ethical considerations if we had this knowledge. And also we expect it to tell us something about potentially artificial systems. So all these things, we want to make sure to clarify the difference between predictions and extrapolations. And we use the term prediction or explanation so far to indicate knowledge that somehow we have independent ways to check, right, to validate somehow. So if we have a prediction that a person is conscious in a specific state, then we can ask them whether they were actually conscious or whether they can give us a sign of consciousness. This is something that we can test in the sense that we have an independent way to check whether our prediction is true or false. When we get to the point of applying our theory to systems that are different and we cannot rely on these independent methods to check whether the answer is correct or wrong, then what we use as a term is really extrapolation, which we think is more correct. So in the case of, for instance, non-communicative patients or unresponsive patients, our theory might tell us that there is consciousness because all the causal properties are in place, but we really don't have an independent way to know whether the theory is correct, right? So the point is that if we have validated the theory through all the steps that we have just discussed, at this point, the hope is that we will have built enough confidence in the theory that now we can trust its answer when we get into this uncharted territory of applying it in situations where we really cannot test it anymore. Hopefully the theory has been tested, has been validated, and now we can simply extrapolate.
Yep. And maybe as a one final word about this step that we didn't really depict graphically, which is that IIT then also has interesting things to say about other questions in philosophy, even you could say perennial questions in philosophy of mind and metaphysics and so on. One big thing that isn't really mentioned here, for example, is free will, right? What would IIT then say about this age-old question of do we have free will or not? Or IIT leads us to what we describe as an intrinsic ontology, which is an understanding of the world that tries to bridge what we know through our physical sciences, what we know about the world in this objective scientific way, and what we know about the world in the intrinsic way through introspection, through our own experiences. So it's just a teaser to say IIT has lots of very interesting things to say on many other topics that take us beyond only, let's say, the science of consciousness. And we would somehow include that in this final step of then extrapolating, right? Seeing what you can do with the theory, applying it to other very interesting questions.
Yeah, I just need to add to what Matteo said, that I think it's a very important thing that the extrapolation comes at the end here after validation. It's typical and it's very common to criticize theories, and maybe at least in particular from my point of view, IIT for its extrapolations, right? So it's like saying, oh, IIT, says that this weird thing is conscious, or IIT says that this other thing might not be conscious, and what are the ethical implications, down with IIT because of its weird extrapolations. And I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that any theory should not, be considered based on its extrapolations before it's validated. And if it has been validated, and you could start thinking about the generalizations and extrapolations, then if it is your best theory, then you should just have some faith in the extrapolations, even if they go against your intuitions. But it's only at the stage after having validated that they have any bearing, I think. Even if the apparent extrapolations and predictions seem outlandish right now, that it really, really shouldn't matter for your evaluation of the theory until, I think at least, until it has been properly validated and tested and checked for actually working in the everyday normal cases where we have some sort of other independent way of establishing whether or knowing anything about the conscious state of anything else, right? It's I think that's an important thing, and it's a reason why it's a further step, right? It comes later.
Yep. Excellent.
I also want to say that this applies, I think this is a general comment.
Yeah, it's
a template that actually should really apply to any theory, and it's very reasonable. The point is that we cannot help but do the following. We develop a theory based on whatever reason, whatever knowledge we have, And we applied to the gold standard of human conscious or of consciousness, that is adult humans. We can at least take this as a non-controversial case of a conscious being. And then let's say the theory works. We try different states. It explains the presence and absence in various conditions. And let's say the theory is validated. So at this point, really, there's nothing else we can do but trust the theory. And the moment we ask a question about a system that we really don't know anything about, the only tool we have in our belt here is really just trusting the theory and going with whatever our best knowledge is in that moment. That can, of course, be refined. It can be expanded. But the point is that there's a difference between making informed extrapolations based on a theory that has been validated and instead making basically a guess based on, for instance, some gut feeling or some pre-theoretical assumptions or something that just feels maybe counterintuitive. And in this case, I think it's very important because there are all sorts of things that can feel counterintuitive, but actually be perfectly reasonable and correct.
So thank you very much. This was these were our 6 steps. And if people want to dig in further to these different steps, you can visit the wiki, and we actually go through them, with a bit of text and so on. And in future episodes, we are going to unpack a lot of the things that we just outlined in very broad terms. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.